Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 112, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. We are right in the middle of a storyline called Last Man Standing, and John has been approached by two different groups. Both are from Arthurian legend. We have the Knights of the Round Table and a man named Mirrodin, who is actually the old wizard Merlin. And the Knights of the Round Table want John to help them fight Merlin because obviously John is a magician. And Mirrodin wants John's help finding the Holy Grail, which is supposed to have been stolen by King Arthur himself from Mirrodin, and that is what started this whole thing. And as part of his search for looking for the Holy Grail, Mirrodin, now using his business influence on the government, has been digging up and destroying all the magical sites in England, specifically all the ley line sites, which is actually what feeds the magic of the Knights of the Round Table, and I believe makes them immortal as well. Now, of course, John doesn't want any part of either of these groups. He's like, that's your problem. Why do I have to get involved? But it turns out that John actually knows the man who is the same bloodline of King Arthur himself. And at the end of the last issue, we saw Jack the Green talking to John, and he tells him who of his friends is of the royal bloodline, and it is his friend Rich. And that is where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 112, we got the cover. We see Rich is trying to hang up some sort of sign that says Rich the Punk, Psychic Sleuth, and he's standing on a ladder to do this, and John is underneath him, and John is pushing the ladder out from under him. And we also see on this cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see we are in some kind of pub, and Rich is ordering a drink from the bartender, and he's saying, 2 pints of particles and a goldfish for the road, please, Barry. And Barry looks a little bit confused at this, and he says, right, that's 2 pints of Guinness and Glenfiddich, isn't it? And Rich replies, cheers, big ears. And as Rich is handed the drinks and he walks out of the front door, John gets some money out of his pockets and he hands it to the bartender. And the bartender looks at John and he asks, is it me or is he getting worse? I mean, does he always talk like that? And John answers with a smile, only in his more lucid moments, Barry. But then his smile kind of fades, and as he thinks, his narration says, course, what with Rich being the true king of our land, he can talk however he bloody well likes. As they say, truth is stranger than fiction. Rich, on the other hand, is stranger than both. Then John leaves to go out to the table that Rich is sitting at in front of the pub, and as he exits, we see Rich hold a drink up to him and say, here you are, con job. Get your laughing gear around this. And as John walks over to him, he says, cheers. You sure you're all right with this then? And Rich answers, no worries, mate. I just get off the A4 at Lydney and pick up the stuff at Nars Court, right? It'll be a doddle, as long as I drive in a straight line. And then they both take big drinks of their pints, and as John drinks, he looks around and he notices there's a woman with a baby carriage and also a man who's kind of holding his ear, and he gets very suspicious, and it seems for good reason, because we get a panel of the woman close up, and there's no baby inside that carriage. It's actually a reel-to-reel tape machine, and they are recording the conversation that John and Rich are having. And over this panel, the narration says, yeah, well, that's the least of his worries. I mean, I've had to edit the truth to conform to his version of reality, so to speak. I haven't actually lied, mind, but I've implied that this stuff he's getting is most definitely dodgy and quite possibly narcotic. It's a lot easier than explaining he's about to go and find the bleeding Holy Grail. In addition, I've accidentally left out the bit about Mirrodin's amateur surveillance club. The Secret Service are watching us in force today, I see, and holding the wrong end of the stick as usual. Someone must have told them this was a fancy dress party, because they've all come dressed as a sore thumb. But even with the surveillance team standing out by the way that they dress, Rich doesn't notice them at all, and once he finishes his pint, he says to John, I'm off then, mate. Give Slark one for us, eh? And as John lights his cigarette and sits down at the table, he says, will do, mate. And as John takes a drag of his cigarette, he thinks, poor bastard. He thinks he's doing me a noble favor, but he has no idea just how noble he really is. I ought to be ashamed of myself, sending him off to almost certain doom without the proper directions. And as Rich gets in his car to leave, we see more people surveilling from a car, and one of them is saying on a radio, "Control, this is Metal 5. We have a runner." Then we see John get up from the table, and he walks over to a nearby tree, and his narration says, "Ah, well, nothing I can do about it now, is there? It's not my responsibility anymore." Then John says to the tree, "Just make sure you get him there safe and sound, all right?" Then we see a face form in the leaves, and it is Jack of the Green, and Jack says to him, "Calm yourself, John. We'll take care of the king. Be assured of that." Then we cut to the VW van driving away, and the surveillance car is following him, and we also see a helicopter, so Mirrodin has really pulled out all the stops on the expenses for this surveillance. And we see the guy in the car saying to a walkie-talkie, "Control, runners on the move. We're in pursuit." And then the helicopter responds, "Roger that, Metal 5. We'll stay with you from here. Just do us a favor and turn off the bloody surveillance, Mike, eh? Tuneless bastards making our fucking ears bleed." Then we cut to the inside of Rich's VW van, and he's singing along with a portable CD player in his front seat. "Human punk, human punk, human punk, human punk," which is a song from the British punk band The Ruts. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Human Punk. Then we turn the page and we cut to evening on the same day, and we see the surveillance team in the car is still following Rich, and the passenger in that car says to the driver, "I swear this bloody assignment's getting on my nerves, Ray. I was supposed to be at Katie's school play tonight." And Ray replies, "You should have followed my lead, son. Then you wouldn't have to keep making up all them shitty excuses." And the passenger says, "I told the wife I was having an affair, didn't I?" And as the driver Ray laughs at that, we see them pass a sign that says Gloucester, 47 miles. Then we cut to Rich arriving wherever he's supposed to arrive. And I gotta say, Rich is pretty clueless because these guys are parked right behind him. They've been with him the whole time, and he hasn't noticed them at all. And as he gets out of his VW van, we see a stone wall surrounding a house, and there's a stone archway in that wall, and Rich walks straight through it, and as he does, the passenger in the surveillance car says, "Control, you with us? Where are we?" And Control answers, "Keep your cool, Metal 5. We're at Nars Court. It's just some abandoned stately home." But just as Control says that, Rich passes through the stone archway, and all of a sudden flowers and butterflies appear, and we see a man appear in the doorway of this abandoned home with a torch, and he's saying, "Over here, my lord." And Rich sees the man and he says, "Oh, you John's mate, eh?" And as Rich approaches the man says, "I've not had the pleasure of that acquaintance, sir. One day, perhaps. I'm Nab. Ever your humble servant, of course." And Nab is even putting his head down as he says this, like he knows that Rich is the king. But Rich doesn't pick up on this, and as he follows Nab inside the house, he says, "Fucking bastards, eh, Bob? I mean, you pay all that money on the electric bill, and then it goes out in the middle of EastEnders." And as he enters the house, I think he's seeing something different than we're seeing, because we see like a dilapidated old house, but he says, "Nice place, though. This where you got the stuff, is it?" And Nab answers, "Not here." Then we cut to the dining room of this house, and we see a roaring fireplace next to the table, and Nab is handing Rich a pint. And as he does, Rich says to him, "Cheers, Bob." And Nab says, "It's Nab, sir. I must confess to my surprise that you've not visited us before. After all, our court is full of story. Here, so they say, is where the nobleman Fenwick first crossed the Nether into Faerie, bringing with him a promise of trade to their king. Poor Fenwick. He was consumed by the fairy realm's promise of abundance and entranced by its icy queen. Knowing little of fairy glamours, Fenwick was thus consumed by them. At this very spot, they say, he crossed for the last time into the Nether and disappeared in flames up to his chimney pot." And as Nab is saying this little story, where we see a nobleman, we can assume it's Fenwick, and he is at the same table that Rich now stands next to. We see there are two people with him, and as the fireplace flames engulf Fenwick, for the last time, I guess, they just kind of smile each other through the flames. And one of the servants looks like a man who looks quite a bit like Nab, and I think this is supposed to be him as a young man, or whatever he is, because he's got pointy ears, so maybe he's not a human. But it seems like Rich wasn't even paying attention to Nab's story, because he was busy guzzling down the pint that was handed to him, and he says, "Yeah, Christ! This fucking beer tastes like donkey sperm." And Nab responds, "Quite." Then we cut to daytime, and I guess maybe Rich was driving all night, and by the time he goes into the house and then comes back out, it's daytime now. And we see these surveillance people are being approached by an elderly woman who walks up to them with a handful of flowers and says, "Buy some lucky heather." And the man who's the passenger says, For the last time, Granny, I don't want any of your fucking heather. Now piss off. And the old woman says, I'll put a curse on you both then, sonny boy. Then we see Rich in the courtyard behind the stone wall so the security guys can't see him, and Nab is pointing a certain direction down a stone path that leads further onto the grounds, and he's saying to Rich, This lane was left to us by Rome, sire. Take it to Lindney, to the alehouse. You'll be met there by our man. And Rich waves to him and says, Yeah, well, let's hope their beer tastes better than yours, eh, Bob? Then we come back out to the surveillance guys, and Ray, the driver, is yelling towards his friend, Will you bloody give it a rest and come on? He's going out the back way. So both men run into the courtyard and after Rich, and as they do, the old woman kind of laughs to herself and she says, Enjoy your swim, fine lads. Then we see Rich just standing in the middle of the woods on this stone pathway, and he lights a cigarette, and as he does, we see the surveillance guys are tracking him, and they're hiding behind a tree, and one of them says into a walkie-talkie, Control, this is Metal 5. Subject appears to be ingesting illicit substance, possibly marijuana. Shall we take him out? And Control responds, Don't be a futwick all your life, Metal 5. Just follow him, all right? Then we see Rich taking a big drag of his joint, and he says, Then all of a sudden, he's enveloped by like a blue energy, and he completely disappears. And the surveillance guys run out, and the one that was on the radio says, What happened? Where'd he go? And Ray replies, How should I know? Then we see Rich still enveloped by that blue light, and he appears in the center of a town. And as the blue energy disappears, he looks at his joint and he says, Fuck me. Then we cut back to the surveillance guys, and Ray is yelling at his partner, You stupid git! You were supposed to be watching him! And his partner replies, So what were you supposed to be doing? Polishing your fucking nails? Then we get a panel of the helicopter hover above them, and the person on the radio says, If you're quite finished, ladies, now might be a good time to go and find our boy, all right? Unless you want 10 tons of fire and brimstone up your arse when our lord and master finds out. Then we cut back to the town where Rich is walking down a cobblestone street, but we do see it is modern day because we see a police car drive by, and Rich instinctively throws his joint to the ground, and then someone says from behind him, In here, sire. And as Rich turns, he sees an elderly man open a doorway and greet him in, and the man says, If it greet you well, my lord, our house is now yours. And as Rich enters the house, even though outside it was modern day, inside it looks like the tavern from Abaton. Everybody looks like they're wearing Renaissance fair garb, but Rich once again doesn't really seem to notice the change in people's appearance, and he says, Chill out a minute, mate. I'll just get a beer in, all right? But the man who is escorting him puts his hands up like he's worried, and he says, What? No, I mean, I'll fetch you a mug immediately, sire. We had little time to make ready. Then it seems Rich kind of looks around and notices these people look a little bit different, and he says, Far out and sod it. What are you lot then? Morris dancers? Where's the gig, man? And the man replies, Morris dancers? There was no time for the arrangement of dancing, sire. We thought your business too pressing. Please, stay a while and drink with us. We've addressed your seat as is customary. And then he motions to a chair that is next to a couple of busty women, and Rich smiles big, and he goes and sits in between them. Then another man walks up to the escort, and he says, Whatever's become of this land, Chaucer, methinks it hath also become of our king. He's as mad as arseholes. And then he gives the crazy sign, waving his finger in circular motions near his temple. And the escort, who we now know as Chaucer, says to the man, Aye, Renner, this one's addled by wine, women, and song. Nevertheless, he resembles Arthur greatly, does he not? Then we get a panel of Rich staring at the women's breasts who he's talking to, and Renner obviously sees this and he says, True enough. So apparently King Arthur is a bit of a ladies' man. Then we turn the page, and we cut to John, and he's waiting outside of Shell and Rich's flat, and as he smokes a cigarette, his narration says, Well, there you have it. The fate of the Western world now rests on the hairy palms of King Vicious I. I've not felt so bloody helpless in years. Somewhere out there, my dopey mate's standing in the crossfire, and all I can do is wait here, hoping he makes it back in one piece. Then we see Danny come out of the door, and she's holding cider, and she says, John, what's up? Something wrong? And John answers, It's nothing, love, really. But Danny gives him a suspicious look, and John's narration says, Nothing but the loss of a little boy's dad. Nothing but my daft mate, wide-eyed and clueless, in the company of God knows what. Nothing less than Britannia herself, hanging from the edge of a long fall by her short and curlies. Then all of a sudden, Michelle runs out of the house and says, John, there's some weirdo on the phone. And John replies, what? Who's calling, Shell? And Michelle answers, he never said, did he? So John walks in the house and he picks up the phone and he says, hello? What? Right. Well, how the fuck should I know where he went? Did you try down at the pub? I don't care what you think. He's got nothing to do with it, all right? Yeah, sorry about that, mate. Better luck next time, eh? And as John hangs up, Michelle says, Christ, I thought the bleeding thing had been disconnected. Almost shit myself when it rang. And Danny asks, who was it, John? And John answers, nobody important. Then we get a panel of who was on that phone, and it was Mirrodin, and he looks very angry that John hung up on him. Then we turn the page and we cut back to Rich, and he is now walking through some woods, and he's being led by Chaucer, and Rich is telling him a story saying, so anyway, he gets out of the taxi, and there's puke dripping down his arms, right? And I'm supposed to help him into the emergency room. And Chaucer politely replies, remarkable, sir. Then we cut back to the surveillance guys, and we see that their car is completely engulfed by growing branches, and Ray the driver is trying to pull them off, and he's saying, I don't bloody believe it. He was only gone 20 minutes. 20 bloody minutes. And we see his partner on the radio say, Control, we have a situation down here. Any luck? Then we cut to the helicopter who is over a body of water in some woods, and they're saying, Metal 5, there's some activity on the old railway embankment up at Severn. Get up there sharpish. I think we've got our runner back. And in the panels with Rich and Chaucer, we see they are walking on some railroad tracks, so it seems that the helicopter has actually found where they're at. Then we cut back to the woods with Chaucer and Rich, and Chaucer is motioning for Rich to walk forward, and he's saying, If it please you, sire, our charge must transfer here. And Rich looks confused, but then we see Jack of the Green appear behind him, and he bows, saying, Warmest greetings, your majesty. I am Jack, your friend and servant. And then he grabs Rich by the coat and pulls him and says, Please, our circumstance is grave. We must needs make haste, sire. And then he takes off running, and Rich follows, and he yells, Where are we going? And Jack calls behind him as he runs, Apologies, sire, but we cannot tarry here. There are treacherous about these parts who'd have you harmed. Then we cut to the two surveillance guys, and they have apparently freed their car from the trees and vines, and they are now driving over the railroad tracks. And Ray is actually the passenger now, and he is pulling out his gun, and his partner sees that, and he says, What are you prating about at? Put that fucking thing down. And Ray answers, Shut up and drive. You didn't see a thing, all right? Then we see him lean out of the passenger side window, and we can see Ray and Jack of the Green on the tracks in front of them a little ways down. And as he takes aim, he says, Believe me, I'm going to stick it right up our scruffy little Houdini's tackle when I catch him. There! Then we see Rich and Jack of the Green have made it out of the woods, but they're still on the tracks. But it has turned into a bridge because they're crossing a body of water. And Rich and Jack turn to see this car coming out of the woods, driving very fast on this railroad bridge. And Rich says to Jack, Here you are, look! It's the charge of the Light Brigade! And Jack says, They're no one of consequence, sire. Pay them no mind. But then he gets like an evil look on his face, and his sharp teeth come out, and he says, Truly, methinks they come too fast across this wooden bridge. And just as Rich and Jack make it to the other side, all of a sudden the bridge gives out, and the car falls into the water. So we can assume that Jack, having control over plant life, was able to make the wooden railroad bridge collapse. And as Rich sees this, he says, No way! No fucking way, man! Did you see that? And Jack, who's still trying to hurry Rich along, says, Hi, Lord, I did. Hurry now. Our destination's upon us. So he pulls Rich forward, and the tracks are leading into a tunnel. And as they walk in, Rich is still looking behind him, saying, You wait till I tell Conjob this, man. He'll fucking shit himself. But Jack is pointing to something in the tunnel and says, Doubtless he will. Look, sire. 'Tis what your line have hidden all these many centuries, Lord. All of God's hold on this world is in it. Then we see what he is pointing at, and it is another one of those octagonal-looking boxes, like the one that Mirrodin was after. And Jack continues saying, This place hides halfway between Albion and Nether, undetectable from either side. The box is unmoved, Majesty, as I did promise. So, sire? And he says that because as he turns around, he sees Rich is sitting down on a rock, and he's holding his head like he's got a headache or something, and he says, In here, I know I am your king, good spirit. What am I to do for my country, Jack? Outside of this place, I am an ordinary man, a dullard. How am I supposed to save Albion without knowing myself? And Jack walks over to him and says, "Every man is no dullard, sire. Indeed, methinks you are better positioned to act as a king than those who currently claim it. This man, Constantine, he is a useful ally and perchance an honest rogue. Follow his lead." And Rich says, "I'm glad I've chosen him to be a friend, Jack. But even he can't help me overcome this fear. When I go back, I'll not know who I am or my responsibilities." And then Jack walks over and puts his hand on Rich's shoulder and he says, "Aye, but you're here, Lord. Such idiotic bravery evidence that you are our king, no matter the standing of your house." Then Rich stands up and Jack points to the box and says, "You must return the box to Albion. You know 'tis not for my kind." And Rich asks, "Am I doing the right thing, Jack?" And then he goes over and he picks up the box, and Jack replies, "That question is dire indeed, sire. For the answer to it, methinks, you must look within." And Rich says, "Well put, of course." And then he slightly opens up the lid, and we see a glowing light emanate from the box, and Rich looks at it, but we don't see what's inside. And he says, "God, this marvelous thing. It fills me up, Jack." Then, all of a sudden, in the next panel, Rich is holding the box standing next to his VW van. They don't explain it. There was no magic to be seen. He just opened the box in this cave, and when he closed it, he just magically appeared outside next to his VW van. Then we turn the page, and we cut to Mirden, and he's saying into a phone, "Disappeared? Well, of course I understand. People disappear every day." And then he throws the phone away from him and yells, "I suggest you give some thought to that on your way back home." And then he composes himself and begins to walk across the room, and he says, "My box! They've taken it! They'll ruin it! No, the moron will go back to Constantine! He won't know what else to do! I need only wait and observe, What do you think?" And then we see he is talking to the Knights of the Round Table. They are all chained up in this room with him, hanging from the ceiling. And the old man who had his head blown off says, "No," because he only has his lower jaw on his head. And the others, like Sanda and the deformed one, are there as well, but they have bullet holes in their faces, and they aren't moving. Then we turn the page and we cut to John Constantine, who's smoking near a window inside of Rich's house. And as Rich pulls up, he says, "About bloody time. What happened, Rich?" And as John comes out to greet him, Rich looks at him and says, "Fuck if I can remember, my son. I must have been stoned out of me tree. Man, I had a right laugh. Your mates are even more mental than you." And a concerned-looking John says, Yeah, so did you get it?" And then Rich opens the side door of his van and he reaches inside and he pulls out a 6-pack of beer and he hands it to John and says, "Too right I did. Here you are, look, a 6-pack of Ruddles." And as John takes hold of the 6-pack, he says, "What? That's it?" But as Rich slams the door and walks by him, we see he is holding the box and he says, "April Fool." Then we cut to inside the house where Rich is putting the box on the table and John says, "Come on, Rich, it ain't bloody funny. Open the box, eh?" And Rich replies, "All right, keep your tits on. Christ, no rest for the wicked, eh?" And then he grabs a butter knife and he begins to pry at the lid of the box. And John says, "Be careful." And Rich replies, Yeah. So, what do we get then? Anything good?" And just as he says that, the lid of the box pops off, and we get a panel of from inside the box looking out, so we can't see what's inside of it. And we just see John and Rich staring down at it, very confused and surprised. And Rich is saying, "Blimey." Then we turn the page and we get a full page splash of what's inside the box, and it is a man's head, and the man is blinking like he just woke up or like he's not used to seeing the sunlight. And the head is of a white man with red hair, and he's got a big bushy beard. And as he looks up at John and Rich, he says, "Hello." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.